Hello, everyone, and welcome to Ventures. I'm excited about today's episode with Tony Sagar and Saul Cates. They represent two generations of cybersecurity, and we dive into a wide variety of topics, including the history of the internet, history of cybersecurity, how it's evolved over time, how we think about Web 1.0, 2.0, 3.0 from a cybersecurity and data freedom perspective. But first, a quick note about one of our sponsors that makes this show possible. And in full disclosure, I am an investor in this company, and it's Startup Rocket. If you go to startuprocket.com, there you'll be able to receive customized coaching for a variety of different frameworks and playbooks and canvases that will help you and your team, based on your business model and the vertical that you're going after, to coordinate your information with your team, with your mentors, with your investors, and it helps kind of guide you comprehensively through the process of starting a company from scratch. So again, that URL is startuprocket.com. So for those that are listening to this episode, you can also watch by visiting wclittle.com, and there we'll have more extensive show notes to the things that we talk about today. And if you're watching, you can also listen anywhere that you get your podcasts. You can just search for Ventures. So with that, please enjoy this episode with Tony Sagar and Saul Cates. All right, Tony, Saul, welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Thanks for having me again, Will.
So Saul, it was great, obviously, a few episodes ago to talk about various things right around the new year there. And one of the topics that we talked about was cyber, the history of cybersecurity. And there was somebody that you mentioned that we may want to talk to. You want to take a moment to kind of tee up this conversation?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, so thank you for the previous episode. We had a great time on that one, and cyber was one of the things like I want to dive into more. And thankfully you said you'd listen to another round, but happened to be able to be blessed by a couple good friends in my career that I met, and one of them is Tony Sagar. So I'd love for him to introduce himself, but this is no offense, Tony, and others of the old guard, but he is the old guard of cyber, and he was there building the rooms that I learned in. So I'm honored to have you, and Tony, maybe introduce those that don't understand who you are, because you are history of cyber.
Well, I'm old, that's for sure. Somehow I became a graybeard instead of following the graybeards around. So, but thanks for the kind introduction, Saul. I'm at like 44 years or so and counting, and had no idea this was the world I was going to grow up in, to be honest. So, just for quick background, undergraduate in mathematics. My dad was a three-war Army veteran. The standing joke is, though, that he never fired a gun in anger except a grease gun. He was a diesel mechanic and a supply sergeant and so forth, but served, during the time of three wars, and goes back a ways, back to World War II, and he served in the Aleutians as a Navy Seabee back then. So public service was in our family. That's our life. My whole family's involved with that, and I never wanted to do anything else. I came out of college. Undergraduate degree in math. Not long before I got out is when the draft ended in Vietnam. So, the question of how does one serve in that sort of turbulent times back then? And I always wanted to work actually for the Department of the Army. I wanted to be a math guy, modeling guns and rockets and that kind of stuff. I had a little taste of that in my summer jobs and really wanted to do more. Wound up getting a call. I had applied the year before for the position at the National Security Agency. And they called, at the end of the summer when I was still working up at Aberdeen Proving Ground. And true story, we'd like to offer you a job, son. That's the way they talked to young kids like me back then. I said, great, what is this job? He said, well, it's in our Communications Security Intern Program. I said, great, what's that? And the honest to God answer was, can't tell you. Oh, okay. He said, but if you go look in the Encyclopedia Britannica, and look up an article on something called cryptography. And he had to spell it for me. He said, you'll get an idea what this is about. He said, I need an answer pretty quick, though, because the job closes in 2 weeks. And if you can report in 2 weeks, the job is yours. I said, I don't have another job. I'll see you in 2 weeks, but I'll go read the article. So I wound up, it turned out to be one of the biggest employers in the world of mathematicians, even liberal arts undergrads, and wound up in communications security is what we called it back then. So cryptography, confidentiality was the problem of the day. Grew up, 3 years in a really generous intern program, the chance to work in amazing things. And one of my real shaping tours was in It's called the Computer Security Design Guidance Division. I never heard of such a thing, right? Computer security and design. What is that? And I found myself in the company of some really smart engineers and some of the real pioneers of formal computer security as we knew it back then. From there on, I stayed in defense at NSA, which is kind of an unusual career path. And my whole career was really about vulnerability finding. So finding flaws in U.S. Cryptography, randomization, then I switched to computer science in software and systems and devices. And so that's what let me ride the wave that we call cyber. So, again, I wish I could have told you that I knew what was going to happen. I picked this amazing path and I could learn all these things, but I wasn't that smart. I switched from math to computer science because I figured out if I did that, and these were the very early days of kind of computer analysis, NSA would buy me an Apple II Plus to have on my desk. And I thought that was like the coolest thing, where computing, right, was giant rooms, punch cards.
Right.
If you remember TSO, does that ring a bell? JCL, cards, magic incantations that I always managed to type wrong. I was like, what a miserable way to make a living. But this idea of personal computing was just a grabber. It's like, it's on my desk. I could actually understand this thing. And what we saw was the early days of how we would use essentially commodity microprocessors, off-the-shelf software to compose high security systems. And that was just unthinkable before that time, And the lesson to me, I'll wrap up with the background, is that economics always wins, right? You might have a better security argument, but at the end of the day, people are not going to throw away PowerPoint and Word, because you don't trust them, right? They want capability. And so there's always this tug between, what's the most secure thing to do. But my view is, and this is as a security guy, right? If you don't acknowledge user preference, economics, incentives, etc. So my whole life has been about finding flaws. And if I could give you the last summary, so I sort of, maybe the first third of my career was learning the craft, right? Finding problems. The NSA was the place to learn that, believe me. It's just amazing trade craft. And at that time, late 70s, 80s, the knowledge was really in-house knowledge at NSA, right? And our close friends, of course. The middle third of my life was I moved into management. And why that was relevant was because I got to see systems fail at very large scale. How we would test them and they would fail, how they would just fail for no reason, how bad guys would attack us. And then having spent my life as a defender inside an intelligence agency, you get to watch really the national fight, right? How things really happen at the nation state level. And so I consider that sort of graduate school and vulnerability finding. And then conceptually, the last third of my career was trying to figure out what's going wrong. We keep finding these problems and we come back 6 months later and they're still there. And we come back a year later and it wasn't because people are lazy or they don't care, right? It's that fixing problems is a really different problem than the challenge than finding problems. And so I just became consumed with this, how do we translate knowledge into positive constructive action? And that's what, let me finish out my career, again, still running the vulnerability finding stuff at NSA, and but also carrying that on into my second career, nonprofit land, with the Center for Internet Security. Like, we know enough to make great progress, not perfection, but progress. And why can't we execute it, right? As an economy, as a nation, as an industry, what is holding us back? And so trying to address those issues has been my life. So that's my career in a nutshell.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah,
that's a big one.
That's quite the journey. Thanks for sharing, and looking forward to diving into that more. Maybe Saul, for those that didn't listen to a few episodes ago.
Oh, sure.
You want to do maybe just a quick background and maybe talk about how your story intersects with when you dive in?
I would love to. Yeah, because I was, I would say I was the next guard right after you, Tony. I was, those kids, those Wunder kids being walked in from folks like Wyatt Starnes, who we both know, the John Thompsons of the world from Symantec and others. Those were really good leaders in their own world at their time. And those were people I grew up with. So a little bit of my background, I grew up in cybersecurity as it was evolving, as you guys were building things on the personal computer side. That's sort of an interesting dovetail for me because I grew up with those things. I had to reinvent my favorite game every day because I didn't have a good way to, I had no way to record my game on my TI-99, right? So I didn't have the recording device. And so I had to keep on inventing a new game every day. So I was one of those people that liked to figure out how to break it all and then reassemble it in a better way every day. And so software was one of those great places to learn. And I did a lot of work at SARC and Symantec research for viruses at the time. I was blowing up things in QA labs, but I ended up working and transitioning into an SC job, which sales engineer, for those who don't know what that is. I got to work with people out in the field, understanding problems and then solving them with vendor supplied technology or available technology. And that was one of the best things I ever learned, was how people like Tony and others worked. I was on that side of trying to break the computer always and use it to my advantage.
Mhm.
And I always got really excited when I got into the defense side, because defending the system was the part that was always magic, right? Because you have to play by the exact same rules that everybody else in that supply chain does, right? How do
Mhm.
you beat the system that's already flawed? And so I've been sort of on the other side of the world, building systems and designing technologies that solve these problems using things like cryptography and other tricks of the trade to beat the box or save the box, right? It's
Yeah.
the box is no longer a room of a computer. It's now an enclave, and an enclave in my world at the time was a room, right? And nowadays we're talking about as chipsets, right, as functions. So my history is sort of like watching the digitization, I think, of a lot of that cyber happen.
Mhm.
How it became a product, how it became things like an enabler for cloud services to become more popular and adoptable. Like all these things that I think you guys helped put down those early rules from really strong self mentorship. Because where else were you getting it from, right? You had to learn from each other and build it.
Yeah.
I was in the world where we were trying to figure out how to aggregate that, and this next generation that's coming up, the next guard that we want to enable, the kids, as you said earlier, Will, our children and grandchildren, they need to have cyber built in by default or taken care of as just a design of the system. Those are the ambitions we want to be able to help with, because getting it right is hard. And you did the whole journey, and I'm doing a shorter version of the masterclass journey as I can, and I'm trying to give the same thing for my kids or better, so that way they can just get right to the answer that's correct. Don't go through the stuff those battles have been won already. Let's go and figure out the next battle. You know what I mean? And that's the part where Tony, you said something that really stuck to me, and I want to take it forward in my life, is I never let myself see a problem twice if I can avoid it. Because if I've seen the problem and I don't have a solution, or at least didn't record the problem, and I don't have somebody thinking through that, then, all hands on deck. Why aren't we staring at the 800-pound gorilla problem, right? Those are things that I wish we could get more leaders helping with that. I think that was a big part of the challenges, is bureaucracy and politics can also have a big impact into how to affect change. But I think economics and the economy, money is probably one of the biggest drivers of everything. And I think I take that perspective, because I was on the side trying to make money by helping, right? So
I
it's
think
interesting to figure out those politics that have to go with the economy.
Yeah, there is a different sort of mindset that got, we discuss this a lot. Sort of, any big institution or small has a culture, right? What you value and how you think, and so there's a lot of discussion in, even to this day at NSA about offense and defense, and so in some sense the work that I lived my life there doing, finding flaws, right? That's a common element, whether you're involved in offense or defense. And so there was this notion, well, it's, hey, people can do either, and we cross-trained everybody to do both. But when it comes down to defense, you need to have a different mindset, right? And so for me, it was moving into management jobs where you could just see the same problems over and over again. And you could meet with people, right, like you, who just can't stand to see that second problem. You can make a great living, even to this day, doing nothing. I mean, there's no better job in this world than sort of, I'll call it classical penetration testing, right? You get paid to show up, poke fun at other people's work, hand over the PowerPoint, you walk away a hero, right? Man, these wizards, these guys are really smart. And then the boss
they
turns
pay
to
you for it,
right? And you got, by the way, no responsibility to fix anything. Right? You're the wizard. Hey, that's great work if you can get it. And I said that work needs to go away, because it's clearly not changing the game, right?
Yep.
And if you were a participant like I was, hey, it's thrilling for a while. You found the first flaw ever in a particular system, but then the second time you go, well, wait a minute, clearly pointing out a problem is different than fixing it. And
yes.
so, and for me, again, the world of incentives, the economics, the misplaced policies, right, that direct people to do exactly the wrong thing,
Right.
Or the way people bought things led them down a bad path. And so you have to look at this holistically. And so there is a mindset about defense, right? You have to love a good hopeless cause. And there's a talk I give. If you're pardon just a slight digression, we all wish. So I like cheesy old movies. I do. I love movies. And one of my favorites is Independence Day. Will Smith, right?
Yes.
And we all wish cyber defense was like Independence Day, right? The bad guys. Here come the aliens.
Yeah.
Hey, here they come. They're out there, and brilliant people, right? We take the old captured alien spacecraft. Brilliant minds reverse engineer it. A brilliant heroic mind, figures out the virus. The heroes fly up there. We know where they are. We land. We deliver. Escape just in time. Boom. Celebratory cigar. Get home. Parade for the good guys. Now we say, hey, 4 decades in cyber defense. No parade for these good guys. Right? It's not Independence Day. The movie it's more like is Groundhog Day. Right? Bill Murray every day. Over and over, right? It's a machine that's running. He gets a little smarter. He tries some changes. Is the change positive or good? So I talk about defense as building a machine, right? An information-driven machine. And once you think of it that way, then you start to think about efficiency, right? You think about inputs and outputs, and how do I make this machine efficient? How do I learn from? And I think that's a conceptually valuable way. And one of my lessons, what sort of brings us together, Saul, and you mentioned some wonderful names, Wyatt and John. I reached a conclusion in the late 90s, 2000 or so at NSA. I grew up there's another talk I give. There's a talk I give on every topic. But one of them is I'm a reformed government monopolist, right? I grew up in a world where national defense, the government is the monopoly player, right? We fight bad guys over there, like Independence Day. Hey, you don't raise an army as a company to go fight, over there. You pay your taxes. The government raises an army, they go up there and fight the bad guys. And that's not the fight we're in now, right? Cyber defense is hopelessly interwoven with our economy. And that really dawned on me at some point. And that's what led me outside the building to find a Wyatt Sarnes, right? Because my boss came to me one day and he happened to have to deal with Wyatt on some other thing. He goes, you need to meet this guy because he talks like you talk. And I think he wasn't sure what it was, but he had good intuition. He said, you need to meet this guy, because he seems to care about the same things that you do. And that's what led me to Wyatt. And I led the campaign, actually in June of 2001, we released to NSA.gov, right, the early days of the web for a government agency, all the security guidance that we were developing for the DoD and the intelligence community. We released it to the public in June 2001. And that was not because I'm a nice guy. It was because I realized the DoD doesn't solve this problem by itself, right? The government doesn't solve this problem by itself. The military had already figured out we never go to war without our friends, right? And so if they don't get better, we don't get better. And this idea of massive interconnectedness, all on the same network, using the same technology, it's more than a bumper sticker, right? We have to find ways to actively work together. So I started looking outside the building, say, who thinks like we do? Who cares about the same data or is trying to track down the same problem? They're not all in government service and they're not all wearing uniforms. Where are they? And so that led me out to, to folks like Wyatt, who was doing something complementary, but was really, what I saw as the core was he cared about the same kind of information that I cared about, right? What was the version of software that was running at the time of exploitation, right? And what was the configuration that would have prevented this? And if that guy cares about that, let's see what he's doing. And of course, he was all over the same stuff, And
he was one of those folks that would connect so many dots so rapidly. Very good leader in that regard. But at the same time, he had that service, that need to serve, in his DNA or in his heart somewhere, because it showed up every time a decision needed to be made. That's one thing I recognize as somebody got to meet you and him and others in those rooms. Like he was the connector of a lot of people and can create some initiative. He didn't always get the big win that he needed, but he did the right thing. It felt like every time he made a good decision, and you could see it.
Yeah, there's a tendency, not universal, but in government service, you think, well, we're government employees, we're special, and they're just contractors out there. They're selling stuff to us. But my experience, wandering the industry, I met some of the most amazing, patriotic, service-minded people, across this entire technology and security industry, right? Great people who are, they have a company, they have a responsibility, a fiscal responsibility. They're making a living. Got it. That's all good. But I always said, I spent my life fighting for democracy, but I love capitalism too. I'm thrilled, right, if industry is doing well, right, and we're not dealing with these sort of criminal level problems of cybersecurity. But I found all these great people, and once you meet one, then they have a friend, and that all expands out, and then you say, what is it we could do together? And my view, and the reason I got permission to release the NSA security guides to the public. Here's what I convinced my boss a couple levels up of, and he was, fortunately, a very progressive thinker about it, and great man, and really just had my back the whole time. I said, we will have more influence, positive influence on the industry by giving stuff away than we will by trying to be in charge, right? We don't want to be, and nobody wants NSA in charge anyway, by the way, just to let you know.
Just to be clear,
I said,
in case that was under dispute, right?
Yeah, but I said, by giving content away, that's the new model, right? Open source was taking off, open standards. I said, we will put it out there to show that we're serious, and here's our contribution, right? We're not the government here to organize you. We're not the ultimate convener. We are participants with our peers, and we're going to bring our share. And so to me, it was as much a show of good faith, for partnership as it was anything else. And I'll one other quick story. So my boss, between me and the deputy director at the time, who finally gave permission, my boss between us was a mainstay of the math program. And if you grow up in mathematics at NSA, this is the queen of sciences, right? This is where it's at. And their model is really different, right? We control all knowledge. And again, mathematicians think a particular way about the capturing of knowledge, journal quality, peer review, blah, blah, blah. So we were going to release all this stuff. And literally the afternoon before, he says to me, he got cold feet. He says, Tony, when we put this stuff out there, and he's looking around like something bad's going to happen. Suppose somebody finds a mistake in it. What are we going to do? And I'm literally biting my tongue, because again, and he's a wonderful man. I respected him. He's gone now, but just a super, super good guy. But grew up differently than me, right? And I said, well, number one, Jeff, we're not writing stuff that's going to stand up for a century. We're giving away operational configuration guidance, right? Which is transient. It's constantly changing and learning. I said, but if someone someone will not likely find a mistake. They may find some idea we didn't think about, and that's good. So when someone does that, and he's really worried, I said, tell you what I'm going to do, Jeff. I'm going to do two things. We're going to fix it. And then number two, I'm going to walk down to the NSA gift shop, buy a coffee mug, and send it to that person to thank them. And we will get more credit, right? And better props from our work, from the world, for putting it out in the first place. No one's expecting perfection. But to say, this is a conversation, right? We're not a big bad government agency here to tell you what you have to do. We are participants. And that was the message that I wanted to send with that. And it turned out to be, if I made one good call in my career, that was a great one. Yeah. To really change the perspective, right? Here's what we bring to the table. Pick at it. Look for the back door if you want to. I promise you there's not one there. That was really a signal for us. And that spawned then a whole bunch of work, the origins of SCAP, if you're familiar with the content automation protocols, the work with Wyatt and the NIST folks, and, all these great industry people who started to coalesce. And they were not working together, back to my original theme, right? Bumping into folks like you. And I know you were one of the kids behind Wyatt. I could just find all these people. And it wasn't so a classical government model is you show up with a giant bag of money, right? And we write a requirements document. And you guys, come to try to feed at the trough here. And I told, including, the friends at Symantec, I don't have any money. Got ideas though. Got some really smart people. We should figure this out together. And again, that was the perspective. I got offers for big funding for like the NSA security guides from the Pentagon and other places. I said, no, as soon as you put money behind it, all I want to say with a straight face, it's the labor of good people. Money goes to ADISA, right, to publish things like the STIGs, if you remember those, and others. Hey, as soon as if you throw money at us, then we're fighting among each other for this, right, for control of money. I'm not interested in that, or we're covered. We do this not because we do this as an outgrowth of security testing, red team testing, blue team testing, and we capture what we learn. Yeah. And hey, by the way, we're nice folks. We want to scale it, give it away, build in tools. And so that was the idea. And that was the real mindset change for my team Again, 99, 2000, 2001, and beyond there. And
Yeah.
but that, the one of the great joys of that, the one, it's not, again, it's the noble thing to do, right? But it's also incredibly satisfying because now you bump into all these amazing people,
Right.
and you go, wow, the government doesn't have a monopoly on patriotism or public service, and so what a wonderful opportunity to both learn, grow, and contribute, and get so much back.
I'll let Will hop in here, but I'm going to
Sure.
just say one thing what you just said, there's a parallel in the outside world. And then people like Will and me also see the same thing with just really good people in entrepreneurship and others. I mean, Will,
Yeah.
I'd love for you to say a little bit about your story because we're talking about it here, but I think others need to know a little bit about how did you come to this idea that good folks around some money can do something, but money is not the answer to all the questions. It's really sometimes the worst answer.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. I mean, I'm honestly happy to just listen to the two of you. This is fascinating. From a pure education standpoint, and even a dovetailing a little bit into my story, those of us that didn't grow up in cybersecurity, and when we hear the word, us young Gen Xers, when we hear the word crypto, we mean something very different than what OG crypto, right? OG cryptography, and now crypto, that's the cryptocurrencies and blockchains and things. So we have to pay respect.
Your toys, whatever.
We have to pay respect to OG crypto. And but from a lesson standpoint, I mean, I kind of grew up in the world of bioengineering, and and a little story there is that we, the collective scientific community, thought that when we were going to sequence the human genome, coming in the end of the 90s there, and we were going to say, oh, there's only 20,000 genes, and we're going to know all the code, and because code is all like computer programming code, we're going to be able to design drugs to cure every disease. Rah, change the world. That was all the seminars and things that was in the late 90s and early 2000s, all about that. And then we finally did it. And like most things in life, as Mike Tyson said, everybody has a plan until they get punched in the face.
Yep,
and
beautiful.
We, the collective bioengineering community, genetics community, got punched in the face when we realized we don't know what the genome is. And I remember being in a seminar with a bunch of geneticists when the top geneticist at the time, after we started making drugs and it wasn't working, where they kind of said, okay, please don't share this, although it's probably fine for me to share it 20 years later now. I won't name names, but top geneticist was basically like, covers the mic a little bit and says, guys, I have no idea what the genome is. everything we learned in school around DNA to RNA to protein, the central dogma of biology, turns out it's way more complex than that. So the whole field of epigenetics and everything came out. So anyway, I grew up in that world, but as I was finishing my doctorate and kind of in grad school, kind of in the early 2000s, I started learning to code. And I started learning how to build web apps. And I remember this is where it dovetails into cybersecurity. And I remember building one of my side projects and deploying it onto the web for consumers to log in, put in their password, log in. And I remember, thankfully, I had friends that were more advanced than me in this, and who looked at my code early on. And think about how many people didn't do this, but looked at my code early on and said, Will, you can't store your users' passwords in plain text. Right?
Yes.
That was my lesson. And hey, just because it says HTTPS and you're sending data over a secure connection doesn't mean that anything you're sending that person is secure. So anyway, so the short version of my career then is I went from finishing the doctorate in bioengineering, building lots of internet companies, building a web hosting company, learning about cyber and learning about how the internet works, and a little bit just from a very different perspective than the two of you. But I remember, running that hosting company, experiencing all the DDoS attacks and various flavors of what the hackers were doing to sign up for my service and then sign up for 20 other different services around the internet and run all the relays and things that they were doing. So once I was privy to that, hopefully I stopped at least my contribution to those types of attacks. So anyway, then I ended up, those companies were in the right place at the right time. ended up being able to sell off the marketing conglomerate and the web hosting company. And then just the last 10 years, I've been investing and trying to figure out how to help founders most effectively. And that's kind of led into our journey with Proda, where in addition to money, we have talent that has gone around the block multiple times in enterprise security, all the way into startup land. And we just have a genuine heart to help and to care for the founders that are coming through, because it's a very different world now. So anyway, that's a little bit about me. And so from an education standpoint, for those that just maybe don't know anything about cybersecurity, they think of it as Independence Day. They think about the bad guys coming in.
Mm-hmm.
And, as you were talking about the Independence Day versus Groundhog Day story, I think you were subtly referring to that it's not as obvious as the bad guy being out there. Tony, do you want to speak a little bit just from a basic cybersecurity 101? How has it kind of changed over time? And we can dive in later a little bit into how people should be thinking about it. But I'm curious, just a little history lesson might be fun.
Yeah, I think that, I came up through the sort of formal computer security route, and I've been involved with every sort of model and risk assessment process and everything that you can name. And as you were telling the genome story, I had a similar sort of a deja vu feeling, right? Models are great, but they're models,
right?
And they don't survive real life. And I said, every model I've ever been involved with, and some brilliant people, I mean, big time PhD, math, all kinds of smart people, but the presence of an active attacker, they don't respect your model, right? They
your rules mean nothing to me. I'm going to break your rules.
And so you have to think of models as abstractions, right? They're important because you can't deal with millions of data points of badness. At the same time, you have to be perfectly prepared for, this notion of active attack really changes. Mm-hmm. And when the government, and I confess my sort of early monopoly days, right? And my work was really aimed at primarily cryptographic devices or security devices. And the quip about monopoly was correct, right? There's actually some truth to that. The government paid for everything, defined the requirements. They would pay people like me to say, you attack this thing like you're a real bad guy, we'll fix everything you found. And we had the luxury. So what we had the luxury of back then, 70s, 80s, as much time as we needed, right? As much money as we needed. Didn't feel like it, but we did. And control of the environment. We could decide who gets to write software. Don't have a clearance? Sorry, you can't work on the government system, right? You're not a trusted supplier to us. Too bad. You can't work. You could control the environment. And nobody today has any of those three, right? They don't have enough money. They don't have the luxury of time. I mean, when I grew up, it took you 15 years to build a new radio for the U.S. Army. That was, so you had the time to cycle, right? And very complicated systems, pushing the edge of technology, but you had a lot of time, relatively speaking. But control of the environment is the killer, right? I used to say, did I miss the meeting where we decided it was a good idea to share the internet with the bad guys? Like, what were we thinking here?
Why was this decision made? I want to talk to that person.
Why was I not in that room? Well, obviously, no one made that decision, right? No one designed it to be the economic infrastructure for our economy. It happened that way, and for better, for worse, that's the way it happened, right? Great ideas, great minds, great researchers. Hey, I could build this on top of that and do this on top of that, right? You didn't design it to be the trusted, it was designed to protect against nuclear weapons, right? If you blow out half the nodes, you can still communicate, And so it was designed for a different day, but it became our economic and social engine. And so now you have this complexity where you don't know good guy from bad guy, but you're on the same network, same technology. You're in this constant interlocking business relationships with folks that you really know nothing about, right? So you have this incredible complexity of the problem here. And then the attack surface is sort of unmanaged, unbounded. And so that's the world that we're in. And it didn't matter. I told you about my conclusions in the late 90s, early 2000s, right? There was no DoD perimeter, for lots of good reasons, right? The DoD started to outsource everything from the way people got paid to the way they shipped goods from A to B. No one got paid. Nothing moves. No one fights without their friends. And I used to give my Tony's 3 rules of war, and I say this respectfully to all my friends in uniform, but this is the reason why I should never have been in uniform. Right? 3 rules of war: you never go to war without your friends. Okay, and that was U.S. Army or military doctrine, right? They called it joint vision and all that stuff, right? Think of the Middle East. You have to build these coalitions of 30 countries, right, to do anything. So you never go to war without your friends. You don't know who your friends are until the day before you go to war, because these are complicated, politically fragile, things. And half your friends can't stand each other, and they certainly don't trust us, right? So now you're trying to build what's called common command and control, right? We're going to do really dangerous things, high explosive things, moving, but I got to know good guy from bad guy, right? And that's changing. So this really complicated operational environment says that you have to think really differently about IT. Imagine now you're the IT guy that has to support that, right? And certain stuff is shareable, but not everything, right? And this, to make a common view of where the good guys and bad guys are, you got to put together the combined views of 30 parties conceptually, but they're not allowed to know everything. But we need to give them the output of certain radars or certain databases or certain blah blah blah. So it's incredibly complicated to execute this, and so that's the problem. Then now the economic equivalent of that, right, is this. I now want to shop and bank and communicate and correspond with friends and have business transactions with this wide world. And so we've had this struggle of sort of how do we build this infrastructure. And so what you have to assume is that nothing is really trusted here, right? And there's nothing that's perfect either. So the government doesn't build perfect things, and so you're now we're stuck with one of the most challenging theoretical problems. How do I build systems I can trust from components I can't? Right. So, but trust, again, even that has changed. So I used to call trust a binary condition, right? You're trusted or you're not. You're cleared or you're not. You're a trusted supplier or you're not. Well, that's not true anymore. And that disappeared 20 years ago or started to evaporate when you started to see these integrated supply chains, right? Walmart, they don't want to store stuff in a warehouse. When the inventory gets below a certain level in the store, they want to have a contract that says you will ship directly from your factory to my store, not through an intermediate place where I got to pay, heating and costs and shipping costs. Automotive industry did a lot of pioneering work in this, right? Just-in-time manufacturing, if you remember that kind of term. Yeah. So think of what you're really creating there is what I would call command and data dependencies, or control and data. Okay, so you have to be able to exchange information. Well, the inventory in this database is going way down, and therefore that triggers, my contract that triggers the movement of physical goods from A to B, that kind of stuff. But I can't let them look at everything inside my enterprise, right? They only get to know this. So trust becomes then a dynamic and a negotiated condition, right? There's a purpose for trust, and it's only for that purpose, only for some duration, only for some contract or whatever. And so there's a lot of conceptual problems here. I'm sorry, I'm wandering a bit here, but what it tells you, this is a non-trivial problem to solve.
This is definitely going to be just a part one. And there's something you said, I think, that rung some serious bells in my head here on a number of different topics. But for one in particular that you mentioned is that why the internet was originally designed, right? Around this concept of nuclear weapons. And I'm old enough to remember the feeling of war, like we're going to get attacked, right? I grew up in the Bremerton, Washington area, just outside of Seattle, right? And the naval base. My dad worked for the Navy, and I was right in between a submarine base, a shipyard, right, a big Navy town. And I remember thinking, like, if we're going to get attacked, the missile's going to come right on my house. Right? So I remember that emotion. But I think it's important to call out, because Web 1.0, right, the original web, was this beautiful decentralized set of protocols that people rallied around to try to bring a force for good, to bring sort of power to the people, so to speak, and share information. It was this sort of beautiful utopian vision. And I think I share some of the concern, some of the serious concern about where Web 2.0 went with a massive amount of centralization of data, that when it was economically driven, it resulted in a relatively few number of companies controlling kind of the whole internet. And so what I think you're hinting at, and the things that are going off, is that now in the Web 3 world, we seem to be
decentralized again.
Right? We seem to be swinging back to an era of decentralized protocols, self-sovereign identities, services that are all around the world that could literally survive those types of attacks. And I'm curious, from your perspective, how you're thinking about this, given the trajectory of your career. Are the Web3 things, are we all just kind of crazy, another generation of crazy utopians, or are we onto something here? Is Web3 going to be a thing?
I like a lot of I think a lot of the ideas are very powerful now, and I was part of that generation, right? Oh, we're all going to, information is going to be free and easy to get to, and we're all going to be smarter and make better decisions. Of course, we went completely the opposite direction, and I'm a little bit older than you. Well, I mean, for us, you guys are probably not quite old enough to remember duck and cover drills. When I was in elementary school, we had regular drills, right, where you would literally duck and cover under your desks or go out in the hallway. The assumption was if an atomic bomb landed in the schoolyard, we were going to have to protect ourselves. That was
right.
That was just life. It wasn't just because we were a military family. It was that was just part of the deal here. But this idea of this, and I think that's a fair perspective to think about this sort of decentralized of the infrastructure, right? And the exciting thing for me, and I was really in-house NSA guy. 92 to 94, I wound up on loan out to Sandia National Labs, the nuclear weapons engineering lab. So I got to see a different part of the world. When I came back, though, the web was starting to take off, and I had a couple of really amazing people that worked in my group. And the first one sits me down. I never, again, NSA. Hey, there might be an internet terminal, as we called it, per 100 people, located in the corner someplace, right? Only a certain cast of characters got to use it for whatever reason. But he sat me down, kind of showed me the early days of what was going on. We're wandering through I think it was a university library in Germany, right? Looking at sort of original source texts and stuff. I'm going, oh my God, the world is different. This is amazing. And that sort of excitement of where this was going to go, right? That you could go to kind of where information was. And that information, I think some of the things I think would make sense to me in a Web 3.0 is, and this is a sharing thing, right? When I've talked about sharing things from a government perspective, what a lot of people in government meant was everybody send me all you got, right? Everybody share with me, and I will become the convener, organizer, miner, and then you guys, I'll dole out information to you guys. And those never work. Those never worked in my career. Everybody send me your cyber incidents, and then we'll share them back out. It never worked because people have 50 reasons why they won't share. Legal, right. Classification, blah, blah, blah. I said, the only way you can make those work is if you keep control. What information creators don't want is to give up control, right? For all kinds of reasons, classification, again, liability, et cetera. And so the more we can sort of decentralize in the sense of keeping information under the control of the creator, the more sharing you will get. And I think that's just intuitive to me in the way I've thought about these sort of modern ways that the web could work. Because this idea of aggregation, through intermediaries, whether they're search or whatever, comes with so many social perils, as we're seeing play out in the press today. Sure. So I just, and it's fascinating to watch. So my wife is not a technologist. None of my kids went into this stuff. And to see how they interact, with the web, right, with social media and so forth, and they know I'm slight bit of paranoia is a healthy thing for me. So they get to see this, and they're wary and they know the things to look out for. But it's fascinating to see that they do things that were unthinkable, right, as we were growing up. The reach that my wife's a former teacher, and she is in constant contact with hundreds of former students and their children, right, and their families that she knew well. And it's just an astounding positive social benefit. But then there's all that comes with it, the disinformation that floats through that now takes these groups and breaks them up, right? They one group drifts this way politically, and another group, and people that loved each other now can't stand each other because it's sort of.
She's watching this whole thing.
Yes, amplified the sort of negative emotional things or negative sources, or people have built their own echo chambers, right? Is the term that has really bifurcated us. Anyway, so more healthy mechanisms, and for a next generation of the web, or more about again, the notion I call about in trust is I would have, if I could identify the source of information, right, with some fidelity, then I would calibrate it better, as opposed to the soup of stuff that floats around in there. Right. And so I could be more selective, and I would have to know that information comes from a source that I can calibrate. And it doesn't make it perfect. It means I can calibrate what its meaning is and what its value would be, and so forth. So, but right now you don't really have much control over that kind of knowledge. So I think as a social mechanism, I would love to see us more sort of tied to from source to sink of
Yeah.
how information is managed would make a lot more sense to me.
I was going to add one thing, or ask
Yeah.
one thing for you. Your just sort of thoughts on this sort of subtopic of that Web 3.0 world. I think self-sovereign identity is probably one that's interesting because we're giving the human the responsibility and the accountability of creating their identity, but then
Yep.
being good stewards of their own recovery, leveraging trusted platforms to use those identities. That's one to me is very interesting because it opens up so many new use cases for peer-to-peer or peer to conglomerate or conglomerate to conglomerate or co-op to co-op, right? There's so many ways to think about relationships when individuals become what they really are, individuals digitally, right? And they trust the system. I'm curious about what you were just saying on that. Not only if that happens, that's cool, that's utopia, that's a good step in the right direction, but what about weeding out or culling out the negative of the system, right? I like positive reinforcements where we have anti-corruption. So if you behave badly, you get kicked out of the system. The system doesn't like you. We only reinforce good behavior. That's utopian brain on, right? Thinking that part, but is that something that's part of your game when you think of defense offense? Like in Web 3.0, it's so complex. You could do some really good positive, and you can do some significant negative with the right tweak in the right spot. And that's the part that I'm most concerned with, right? Does that make any sense? That question, because that's the world that I now look through the lens of in this Web 3.0 world.
I think the thing that we have to sort out, as a society to empower that us all. So I'm going to simplify that because that's what I do, right? That everything we do in our life, right, as social creatures involves some risk. There's sort of I call it just three bins. There's stuff you got to do, right? It's built in, it's law, regulation, etc. There's stuff that the market can enforce or not enforce, based upon preferences, right? So, and then there's your individual behavior, the choices that you make. And again, in a sort of classical national defense that I talked about before, the government really dominates that, right? The government does this. You don't get a vote in what the army looks like. You pay your taxes, and it's relatively straightforward. That's not acceptable for the world that we're in today. It's a much more complicated, distributed world. Yet there is still a role for government to sort of establish basic foundational principles, right? They get built into regulation, built into God. And so the only question is sort of how we negotiate what that boundary should look like. But I think as of now, government hasn't figured that part out yet, right? It's people are struggling with it, and I say this with respect. Some of the most noble, smart people I have ever met in my life, or I knew in government service, or they're still there, but there's not that many of them, and there are not enough of them to really understand what these implications are. So there's the sorting of that out, and it's very politically fragile. And that second bin of what can the market encourage or discourage, and and that's been the mantra for not just this prior administration, but the one before and the one before. Let the market tell us what the winners and the losers are. That's not very acceptable either, frankly, because consumers have no way to make a decent choice. Right? There's no notion of what constitutes good or bad. It's too complicated, and so I think building mechanisms that allow people not to make perfect choices, but better choices with some knowledge, which means things like, credentialing, badging, conformance with some sort of frameworks or whatever the right term would be, that would allow people to make more knowing choices about that. And then there's, and again, all our lives are dominated by those kinds of things, right? You have things that are locked into building codes. You can affect the price you pay for homeowners insurance, depending on how far away I live in the rural areas. How far away I am from the firehouse determines my insurance rates. I have a little bit of flexibility to manipulate that choice in there, but I know what the options are. And then the third is my individual behavior. Right? So I'm a grandfather now. I got two granddaughters. I would never let my granddaughters ride in a car with a family that doesn't enforce seatbelt laws. Right? Independent of what the law is, I just wouldn't. So by my choice, the way I shun people or accept their behavior or negate their behavior and so what really needs to dominate is the middle one in this. The consumers need much better ways to make choices, right? And I do a lot of local work here in retirement with the Lions Club and church groups, trying to help, because that's my sounding board, right? Like normal people. Normal people will never become cyber experts. Most of our economy will never hire a cybersecurity expert, right, to work on their staff. So they need much simpler ways to make decent choices about these kinds of things. And so that, how do we then, so my concern is, how do we create the mechanisms that allow those choices to be made, right? And how do I frame those in a way that appeal to lawmakers and regulators and the insurance industry and the legal system? So for me, that's where I'm spending my time now. It's in these sort of defining the practices that make a difference so that they can be delivered primarily through the marketplace. And I do certainly continue to dedicate time to what I would call government service, not directly, but to helping equip people think about these issues, right? And again, there are great folks like you guys, who there's no reason we can't have a great capitalistic, people are making money kind of a system that also has these positive social attributes, right, of trust, right, that allow us to say things about the integrity of the systems that support us.
Yes.
We do all these things in less complicated domains, right? Civil engineering, public safety, public health. We have developed over years things like building codes, all these things that allow us to do that. And I remind people, by the way. And so, Will, you talked about your journey. So I'm old enough that my dad, who was born in 1913, right, when he had a tooth pulled when he was young, there was no certified dentist back then. His bad tooth was pulled by a traveling barber through the backwoods of West Virginia, right? Because he's already gotten him in the chair. Yeah, got him in the chair. Get the pliers. You got a rotted tooth. And the point is, it takes a while to sort of codify the knowledge, right? To develop some equivalent of national credentialing, to sort of build these mechanisms. Now, we don't get 100 years, frankly, to deal with this issue. I think we have to do much better in a more complicated domain. There's no question it's a complicated domain. But, it's also unforgivable for us to, as responsible citizens, not to try and define some of these things, right? To set some guardrails and boundary conditions, and what are expectations for the quality of a piece of software, or the conformance with an interface, that separates, a critical thing from a non-critical thing. I think those are really, essential parts of whatever we're going to do. And the government is not going to go off and do this by itself.
I know.
And is not going to come out with a singular bag of money with a requirements document that will solve it either. It's going to we're going to have to ask people to get together.
It's going to be a coalition, and it's going to be building of trust that is going to take us to get there. I think that's that big barrier of all of it. This is the human trust again. So
yeah, and thanks for letting me riff on about that. I didn't mean to editorialize.
This has been great. I think this is a good part one, kind of the setup, sort of the history and kind of the narratives and kind of the topics that I think are important. And I'll look forward to getting a part 2 on the calendar soon, because I think there's a lot of really important topics to dive into here. Yeah. So really appreciate the time that the two of you can carve out here. And maybe it's just a quick 30 seconds. Where can people find you online? It sounds like you got some new writing that you're doing, and Saul as well. So maybe Tony, you want to go first?
Yeah, just real quick. Also, my work for the last 5 years or so has been at the Center for Internet Security, so cisecurity.org. So we're a small but mighty nonprofit, lots of good things going on. Drop by there. And then I've started to write down some of my career history at Sager Cyber, SAGER. And there's a whole pun that I explain in there, sagercyber.org. But with the support of Public Affairs at NSA, I have a bunch of older writings that were unclassified that I'm now releasing to the public, and starting to write some of these just because I feel, I've spent my life working in a closed society, in an open part of it, and I think I did my share to open it up starting in the late 90s, as I mentioned. But there's a lot of great people that frankly deserve to be remembered. And, Saul mentioned a couple of them here, a number of them in government. And here's my experience. Great ideas don't just happen because of some government 5-year plan or some singular thing. Great things happen when good people get together and say, you know what, we could do this. And so I want to tell those kinds of stories and bring some of that out there. And, for folks that would otherwise not be remembered, or ideas. I remind people back at the fort and in government, the cyber world didn't start the day Cyber Command opened up its doors. There was a lot of history that really led us to that point. So thank you.
Yeah.
No, that's great. And anybody wants to find me, it's just Saul Cates. His Twitter's fine. But Tony, thank you so much for being part of this. This was great, and I want to do another one soon because you are just a wealth of great knowledge and great wisdom. That's the part.
I appreciate it very much. Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity. It's great to talk to some of you really young guys and get some great ideas from you too. Appreciate it.
Awesome.
Appreciate it, gentlemen. Thank you. All right, a couple quick things before you go. Number one, I have a general newsletter where I write about technology and startups and health science and teaching people to code. And I write about a variety of different subjects that we talk about on this show. So if you go to wclittle.com, there you'll be able to subscribe, and you'll also be able to subscribe to particular topics. If you're just interested in one or a few of them, you'll be notified right when I publish new content in those areas. Number two, my partners and I at Proto Ventures have a portfolio company called Startup Rocket. If you go to startuprocket.com, there you'll be able to receive coaching guides and customize an operations framework for you and your team and your advisors to be on the same page in terms of what is the appropriate next step for you and your entrepreneurial journey. And finally, if you wouldn't mind leaving a review anywhere that you have listened to this podcast or watched this podcast, it would be super helpful to help those who might be interested in consuming this content as well. Thank you.